Imagine being able to enjoy a meal, pushing your plate back feeling full and nourished, all while being able to maintain a healthy weight. Sounds a bit too good to be true, right? And although Hashimoto's can dramatically change our metabolism, we can maintain and even lose weight when we shift our thinking away from how much we should be eating and instead focusing on the quality of our food and the satiety that it brings us. So in today's video, I'm going to help you better understand the concept of satiety. We'll look at what the research says, and we'll give you some practical recommendations. That way you can choose better options for yourself to help improve your satiety and allow you to hit those weight loss goals. If you're new to my channel, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Thanks to everyone for hanging out with me today. My name is Dr. Bodle, and over the years, I've helped thousands of patients naturally improve their Hashimoto's and hypothyroid symptoms through utilizing things like nutrition, lifestyle, and supplemental changes. And if you want to continue to learn about those concepts so you can best support your health and healing, remember to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, and also ring the bell for notifications. I have a whole bunch of content and videos these days on a variety of topics related to our thyroid health, and the new videos are available on Thursday mornings. Now, when it comes to choosing a healthier nutrition plan, I often find that the standard recommendation of eat less, especially when it comes to weight loss, isn't very helpful to us. It's an oversimplification to reduce our metabolism down to calories in versus calories out. And our body is much more complex than a bank account, which is what it's often compared to in these types of situations. People will say, if you want more money, then you need to save more and spend less. But again, it's not that simple. Instead, there's a variety of factors that influence when we eat and how much we eat. And satiety is a big piece of that puzzle. But before we go any further, we need to understand the difference between satiation and satiety. Satiation is the sense of fullness that we get during the ingestion of a meal, which I also like to think of it as the ability to push that plate away even if we haven't finished all the food on the plate. Satiety, on the other hand, is the fullness that we feel in between meals. Essentially, how long we go after a meal before we start feeling hungry again and decide to eat. Obviously, the concepts are similar, and the amount of satiation that someone has with a meal will often lead to better satiety. And the way that this is often looked at in the research is by preloading an individual with a specific type of food or macronutrient, having them grade their hunger levels after having that food, then calculating the amount of time until their hunger levels start to rise once again. This then provides us with a satiation and satiety scoring system, which allows us to compare one food to another and determine what foods help us to feel the most full, which can obviously be very important when we're trying to manage our weight. Hopefully, the more full and satisfied an individual is, the less likely they are to overeat during meals, and the less likely they are to eat more frequently than they should. But there is a big caveat to this. There are some very well-written review papers that suggest, even though satiety probably does play a big role in our ability to maintain a healthy weight, the research on satiety just isn't that helpful. And the reason for that is because these research papers are only focusing on calories and nutrients. And we know that there's a whole bunch of other factors that goes into satiety. Things like stress levels, boredom, whether you're distracted or not while you're eating, whether you're in a social situation, or if there's a food around that you're particularly fond of. And it's suggested that these psychological aspects can have just as much or more of an influence on our food intake. This idea that the amount of food is the only thing that matters rather than the types of food we're eating was reinforced by different types of obesity research. In these studies, they manipulated the foods that someone was consuming, but always controlled for calories. And what they found was, it doesn't matter what you eat, as long as those calories are always capped at a reasonable amount for your body. But as you might have guessed from my intro, I take some issue with these conclusions. First of all, do I think that there are psychological factors that influence our satiety? Definitely, and I think we need to be aware of them. However, that doesn't change the fact that the types of food that we're eating also has an influence on our satiety. Next, although I think controlling for calories should be a part of our nutritional plan, those obesity studies were only focused on the weight loss. And even though they were able to achieve that, they didn't pay a lot of attention to what the hunger scores were, what the satiety levels were. And that brings me to my last point of disagreement, which is that it's easy to say that satiety doesn't matter when a test subject is in a controlled environment. If you can only eat what you're given, then you can only eat what you're given. But when it comes to the real world, we don't live in a controlled system. Therefore, we have to actively look for ways that we can leverage satiety, which will help us to reduce the likelihood that we overeat in an environment that often encourages us to do so. So where do we start when it comes to improving our satiety? The easiest thing that we can do is whenever possible, we want to choose whole foods. And understand that whenever we take steps to process or refine a food, it's going to likely increase the concentration of calories and also decrease the level of satiety. What are whole foods? They're foods that don't have an ingredient list. Steak, carrots, fish, apples, broccoli. The more that we can focus on these types of things and prepare those meals for ourselves at home, the better our satiety and satisfaction with meals will be. However, whenever we start to process those foods, which isn't always necessarily a bad thing, we just need to be aware that the nature of those foods and the way that they interact with our body is going to change. For example, as we said before, satiation is the ability to feel full during the ingestion of a meal. But I think the true test of satiation is you having food available to you, but not wanting to eat it for whatever reason. And I will often ask my patients about foods that they have at home that they simply can't put down until they've consumed all of it. Things like a bag of chips or maybe a packet of cookies. Those kinds of foods confer almost no satiation, and therefore it makes sense that for the most part we should probably avoid those foods. But similar things can happen with foods that people consider to be healthier options and have only minimal refinement. A couple of options that come to mind right away include things like cheese or salted nuts and nut butters. Yes, these things are technically minimally processed, they're more whole foods than something like a bag of chips, but is it easy for you to step away? Again, that doesn't mean that the food is good or bad, but we need to know how we respond to it. If you don't get a lot of satiety from a certain food and have trouble saying enough is enough, then sure, it might be the calories that get you in the end, but it's the lack of satiation and satiety when you first start eating those foods that's really letting you down. So, whole foods first, while being mindful that there are still certain options that fit within that category that can be problematic for certain individuals. The next thing that we need to pay attention to is the macronutrient content of foods, which is going to influence the volume of food, the protein content and nutrient content of food, and the rate of digestion, all of which is going to have an influence on our satiety. Now, I know I said before that the review paper stated that psychological factors play a huge role in our satiety, but I think the confusion is that doesn't mean that macronutrients don't play a role. It's just noting the shortcomings of the research that is focused on satiety. And we are going to address those psychological aspects here in a little bit. But in our practical and real-world application, macronutrients are important for us. Now, of course, with any group of studies, there's going to be variability in the results. But if we look at the majority of the data, one thing is very clear, and that is protein is king. Protein, and especially animal protein, because of its nutrient content and complete set of amino acids, confers more satiety than any other food group. You guys have heard me say before that for my patients with Hashimoto's, I typically like them to get a minimum of 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of ideal body weight. Now, of course, this will fluctuate depending on lifestyle, and as always, these calculations are a rough estimate. However, most people are not getting nearly enough protein, and it's impacting their health in a variety of ways. Although the calculation can sound like a lot for some people, it becomes quite easy if you simply include about 3 to 6 ounces of protein with each one of your meals, and the numbers will add up fairly quickly in your favor. But what about bars and protein shakes? Can we use those to help hit our protein goals? I think these are fine in a pinch or for convenience sake, but because they are more processed, they do not confer the same level of satiety to having protein in its whole food form. So use them when you need them, and sometimes we do need convenience. But remember that convenience is one of the enemies of satiety, and it's something that we have too much of in our current lifestyle. Next is carbohydrates, and in my opinion, carbs can fit two main roles when it comes to satiety. Either carbs can check that volume box by including carbohydrates that are high in fiber. When we have larger volume foods, it applies a stretch to our stomach, and that signals increased levels of fullness. This can easily be done by choosing lower glycemic options, such as green vegetables, low sugar fruits like tomatoes or bell peppers, while of course always being mindful of which foods your immune system tolerates. In addition to helping us with the volume of our meals, carbohydrates can also help us to restore glycogen levels after a workout. Especially if someone is following an exercise plan that is on the higher intensity side of things, we can start to more readily deplete glycogen in our muscle and liver. If this is then combined with a lower carbohydrate diet, which can be efficacious for many people, others will find that they have this unrelenting hunger that doesn't seem to go away with other food options. This is where including some more whole fruit or starchy vegetables like sweet potato and squash can be helpful. We always want to make sure that we're matching our food intake to the amount of exercise and activity that we're participating in. So including these foods for someone who is more active is great, but if you are someone who's more sedentary, then you may want to limit them. But definitely keep it in mind if you're someone who's having some issues with that hunger in between your meals. And finally, the last of our macronutrients is fat, which is an interesting one for us. Obviously, fat has a very low volume to it. It doesn't take up much space, but it has a very high energy density or calorie count. Because it's so concentrated, some research on satiety shows fat having a very little effect on our hunger levels, while some research shows it having a negative effect, actually making you more hungry when you eat it. But I'm not so sure about this, and I think that this is another area where the research might be a little flawed. Now, of course, I think it makes sense that when we're comparing one macronutrient to another, we need to isolate that macronutrient as much as possible. But if we think about it, we almost never eat fat all by itself. And it'd be weird to suggest that someone just eat a tablespoon of lard or coconut oil or take a big bite out of a stick of butter. Now, do I think that fat can cause us to be more hungry and crave foods? Yes, I do. But I also think that's in the context of refined fat in the combination of refined carbohydrates. Think cakes, cookies, and pastries. But I think if we look at fat in more of a whole food context, things like the saturated fat found in animal meats, the fat in egg yolks, avocados, nuts and seeds, then we start to see a little bit of a different picture. Now, for some people, we can simply ratchet up that protein intake and their satiety is awesome. But for others, just like with that gnawing hunger that comes from the decreased glycogen levels, they need to have that fat lever addressed to have better outcomes. But the problem that I see here is most people go about this by adding more of those refined fats. Or they melt fat down into a liquid form, which makes it much more easy to consume without realizing how many calories you're taking in. Instead, once again, I have my patients play around with their fat intake by changing the type of food that they're eating and comparing and contrasting how they feel with different fat content as part of their protein. This could look like a ribeye steak versus a New York steak, brisket versus tri-tip, beef versus poultry, pork belly versus regular bacon or even turkey bacon. If you want to add some ghee, butter, or coconut oil after the fact, then you're welcome to do that, but focus on the whole food first. And finally, now that we're done with our macronutrients, it's time for those pesky psychological influences. And this is just another great representation of how our brain and our thoughts can impact so many different things in our body. Like we said before, satiety isn't just about our food. And if we're stressed, distracted, in a social situation, tired, or bored, all of these are going to have an influence on our hunger. Sometimes you're going to be able to mitigate these situations, and sometimes you won't be. But by simply being aware that these things can have an influence, allows you to respond in a more appropriate way. So if you start to feel like you're hungry, ask yourself, am I actually hungry? Or is it some sort of environmental situation that is making me think that I'm hungry? The way that you test this is by, instead of eating as a response, it's by looking at what's going on in your environment and responding to that directly. By trying things like going for a walk, hydrating, doing some breathing exercises, reading a book, or simply getting out of a stressful situation. If that hunger goes away, then you know it was more psychological in nature rather than being a biological need. But psychological influences can oftentimes be the most challenging. And as we said, sometimes we don't have any control over them. We live in a world where we are constantly surrounded by food advertisements, foods that are convenient for us to acquire, and stressful situations that promote eating of those foods. But even with all of that going against us, if we can recognize the environment that we live in, leverage whole nutritious foods to the best of our ability, then we have a much better shot at improving our satiety, maintaining that healthy weight, and losing weight if we so choose. But let me know in the comments what you think. Is weight loss simply about counting calories? Or does satiety play a role? What sort of foods help you to feel the most full? And which ones are things that can get you into trouble real quick and you just can't stay away from? Remember, it's always a journey. None of us will be perfect, and it's all about getting a little bit better every single day. So I'd love to know what's been a challenge for you and what's helped you the most. If you enjoyed today's video but need some more help and want to work with me one-on-one, send me an email at contact@seattlethyroidhelp.com and my staff will reach out to you to see if you qualify for a free consultation. From there, you and I will sit down, discuss your health, figure out what your goals are, and see if we'd be a good fit to work together. Obviously, I don't work with all people, and I'm not a good match for all people. So we just want to make sure that you're in the right spot for you, and you're getting the results that you deserve. If you'd rather work on some things at home, of course, check out any of my other videos on the channel, or grab either one of my free downloads down in the description box, one of which is a foods list that I give to a lot of my patients with Hashimoto's, and the other is an electrolyte mixture that you can make at home, which will help you if you're following a low-carb way of eating. Otherwise, that's all for today. Love you guys. Hope you're having a great week. Remember to do all the good YouTube stuff like, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you'd like daily information, remember to follow me on Instagram and Facebook, links for which are down below. But my name is Dr. Bodle. I really appreciate you guys being here, and I'll see you in the next one.